Competed in university in Canada and continued on after with a club and competed at the Olympic trials twice. And it's to some people that seems like really highest of levels, and I might agree to a certain level, but in Canada versus the United States, for example, the Olympic trials are quite vastly different. If you make the Olympic trials in the U.S., like you're a sort of a top athlete in track, whereas in Canada you can kind of sneak into the Olympic trials in a way, mostly because there's not as much depth in Canada for Olympic trials.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to, of course, qualify and compete, but it's not as hard as it might be in a country like the U.S., where the depth in athletes, level and abilities is so deep. And for example, I would have never qualified for Olympic trials in the U.S.
This episode of the Smart Athlete Podcast is brought to you by Solpre. If you're active at all, whether you're running or simply out walking for the day, you've probably experienced one of the number one problems that active people have, and that's chafing. Solpre's all-new, all-natural anti-chafe balm solves that problem while feeding your skin the vital nutrients it needs to be healthy. If you'd like to stop chafing once and for all and treat your body right, go to solpre.com to check out the anti-chafe balm today. That's SOLPRI.com. Welcome to the Smart Athlete Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Funk. My guest today has his PhD in biomechanics. He's an associate professor at the University of Memphis doing a lot of interesting research. He's also a runner. Welcome to the show, Dr. Max Paquette.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Max, before we got going, we were talking about running. We're talking about your history in running. We're debating a little bit about what it means to be a pro runner. For you, in your own words, you can kind of go over it again. But as a primer, I would consider where you were, at least at one point, probably in that realm, even though there's no official line of demarcation. I think if you're getting close to or at Olympic trial qualifying time, that I think that's a pretty good line of demarcation.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this a minute ago. I competed in university in Canada and continued on after with a club and competed at the Olympic trials twice. And it's to some people that seems like really highest of levels, and I might agree to a certain level, but in Canada versus the United States, for example, the Olympic trials are quite vastly different. If you make the Olympic trials in the U.S., like you're a sort of a top athlete in track, whereas in Canada you can kind of sneak into the Olympic trials in a way, mostly because there's not as much depth in Canada for Olympic trials.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to, of course, qualify and compete, but it's not as hard as it might be in a country like the U.S., where the depth in athletes, level and abilities is so deep. And for example, I would have never qualified for Olympic trials in the U.S. Had I attempted that when I was competing. Just to kind of show you the difference. Like I probably would have been a good 15 seconds off in a steeplechase to qualify, and probably another, 7-8 seconds in the 1500, something like that.
Yeah.
So just to kind of show you like the difference there.
Well, so if you're listening and you're not familiar with that kind of time, it seems like, so if you step back from kind of where you were back to the realm of, say, average age grouper, and they're like, I'm running a 21-minute 5K, like 7-8 seconds isn't a big deal, but at that level, 7 to 8 seconds is a lot.
Exactly.
There's a ton of people in that span.
That's a fair point to clarify that. I think, I tell people a lot because, it's sometimes as a former athlete who compete at some level, right, you're often you'll go run a local 5K, for example, and run, I don't know, 16:30 or 17 minutes. And you're thinking like, people are like, oh, that's amazing. And, I'm at a point now in my life where, one, I can't even do 16:30, 17 minutes or something like that right now. But, when I was able to do this kind of off the couch, if you will, I'd be like, oh yeah, it's all right. And people would almost find that sort of condescending or just because they're trying to break 20 minutes and you talk as if 16:30 is no big deal. But again, I always try to tell people, if you're a 20-minute 5K person and you just run 23 minutes, you probably wouldn't be too happy with it. Right. And they're like, yeah. So anyway, so that's just the relativity of times and performances, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, it's an expectation thing. And as I was saying before we got going, it's a matter. I often mention my kind of friend and former coach, Barbara Lindquist, who was at one time ranked number 1 in the world in triathlon. And I watched her Olympic race. I had never seen it. And then when COVID hit, they were replaying it. And so she competed in the Olympics 2004. And so I was like texting her while it was going on. Obviously this is, 15, 16 years ago now that this has happened. And she was like, oh yeah, the glory days. And she really plays down that whole experience. I think there's just something that there's some kind of mental adjustment that happens that I think if I look at her and then I think about even my own performances versus, like, as you mentioned, that 16:30, 17-minute range, like we run that and we're like, okay, that was okay, but that's not my personal best. I think she does it, we do it, where it's like, I know I've done better. I have higher expectations for myself. So then it's not a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think it recalibrates too with age and I wouldn't say with age necessarily, because you always think about it, but I would say when you come to terms with your current levels of fitness and you objectively assess where you are and say, you know what, I should be happy with X, right? As opposed to whatever my PB is from 10 years ago or whatever. Yeah. And I think at the elite level and the elite mindset, that might take a while to kind of come to terms with that and accept that. But you get to a point where you're just like, oh, okay, yeah, that was, that's normal now. This is fine. This is good. I'm still able, if I'm able to run even a 17-minute 5K or 18-minute 5K, you're still performing at a level that, is probably in the top percentile in the whole world. So you got to kind of think of it that way.
Yeah, I think that's something I looked up before, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but I think you're right there. It's somewhere around that like 18, 17, 30-ish mark where it's like that's the top 1% of times.
Yeah, exactly.
And for people that were involved in trying to be a pro or really take it to the next level, that seems incredibly slow just because that curve's almost exponential,
right?
Towards the performance side where you start to get, Galen Rupp and the other guys going 13 something for their 5K, and you're like, I couldn't touch that if I wanted to.
Or even women now running, low 14s and 14:30s and 20s, and like American distance running, for example, on the women's side now if you run 15:30, it's a solid college time for women, right? And the goal is like now it's more common to take a crack at 15 minutes. It used to be this like, 15-minute mark for the 5,000. Now it's like, all right, let's do it. Let's try it. Let's give it a shot. It's just a more normalized threshold. So across the board, I think that's true.
So this is a little diversion off of you, kind of, but I think you said you're coaching your wife right now.
I coach my wife. My wife from 2000 and let's see, 2015. To maybe the fall of 2014 until last fall, and then she kind of got to a point where we live in Memphis, Tennessee, and great places to run, great city for running, but from a training standpoint, it got difficult for her to just the day-to-day, the motivation to be by yourself constantly, and I was running with her most of the time for workouts, but in January 2019 I tore my right ACL playing basketball, and so I wasn't able to run at all that last year in 2019. So then I couldn't run with her at all, and so she was completely solo. She did a few altitude training camps that was good because she was able to run with people there in Boulder. And then last fall, she, with her agent and with Ben Rosario of NAZ Elite and Flagstaff, there was some conversations about her potentially joining the group. And then the conversations became a bit more real. And then she signed a contract with NAZ and then started on January 1st. And then she's been there and has been running really great, enjoying the environment, the team atmosphere, the group environment. And so now she's fully with the group since January 1 and has been coached by Ben Rosario, who's the head coach there. Yep.
Well, I'm trying to remember where we were a second ago, because something led me into thinking about that. Because I think I'd seen on your Instagram that speaking about her performance, running personal bests after like a 10-year span from college to now.
Sure. She's had an outstanding sort of progression. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, it seems like obviously you played a role in, her training there for time.
Yeah.
How, and as we were just talking about the kind of readjusting expectations, did you, I guess, what kind of mental adjustments did she make, or did you help her stay in to continue trying to find that new personal best? Because to go, to be after something for so long and to take so much time to get there is not an easy feat.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a bit, for her, it's quite fascinating how it all went down. I mean, she just had a really good college career and then at Baylor University and then, turned pro with ASICS for a few years and then had a slew of injuries and joined a group that wasn't a best fit for her. And then that was a few years of sort of no progression, no improvements, lost her contract. Was not sponsored for years, had a couple of switches in coaches. And then I got a job. I accepted an offer for my job that I'm currently in at the University of Memphis in 2012. She was finishing her master's degree at Tennessee in Knoxville. And so she had a year left. And so she stayed back and was coached still there, then moved to Memphis and was coached by someone remotely in 2013 and 14 and did decently well. I think she ran really close to her PB 1500 in 2014. And then that fall, that coaching relationship kind of stopped. And then she was sort of without a coach in 2014 at the end of the year. And then, we sort of decided that I would coach her. It's not always the best option for your, to coach your spouse, but it definitely was the best option at the time for her. And from my perspective, so my background, with running research and biomechanics, it was really a question of trying to get her away from the injury cycle that she'd been in. Mm-hmm. So, I had never coached at her level and not that coaching knowledge doesn't translate from, coaching, sub-elite to elite. It's the same mindset. It's just, there are other things you have to consider, right? So it's a bit more, the outcomes are more important typically and so on. But the big thing was just to try to get her in a out of that injury cycle. Mm-hmm. And so did most of the work around that was to make sure that she was healthy. And, we got her healthy. It took about a year from 2014 to the end of 2015 for her to start, some form changes, some strength that was tossed into that. A lot of work with our physical therapist in town. And then, she had a really good fall in 2015. And 2016, she kind of started out her new career, if you will, as a 5,000 meter runner, because she had been an 800, 1,500 meter runner. And, out of the gate, it was clear that was her event. And she ran 15 teens then in 2016. And then from 2016 to 2019, I mean, she ran, 15:14 to 15:19, like I don't know how many times, a number of times. Mm-hmm. And going back to the whole injury cycle aspect of it, for me, it was never about, yes, I wanted her to get better. And she was better than in 2019, she was better than she was in 2016, but her times didn't really improve per se. There's other reasons involved that, like racing opportunities and things like that, mm-hmm. At the elite level, the race you're in really matters often for fast times. Mm-hmm. And so we won't get into that, but she ended up, just staying there, at that 15:14 to 15:19 range consistently. But her placing at the U.S. champs kept getting better. Her racing was better, and so on and so forth. So, and then in her, her training load, if you will, wasn't crazy high compared to other athletes that are 5,000 meter specialists. And that transition with NAZ Elite was really that big part. Is one is the great environment and Flagstaff, great teammates, great coaching, great resources, and then just the training is just more than she was doing, and she responded really well to it. And so it was a really nice progression that way. It was a good solid 3.5, 4 years of making sure she was away from the major injury cycle, like bone stress injuries and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
She had a couple of Achilles flare-ups, but aside from that, it was just trying to basically minimize the risks of major injuries. Like, to me, a stress fracture would be obviously a major injury that takes you away for enough time that it affects your performance long term. And so then, the progression to NAZ was really seamless, and she's really been enjoying it. And it was overall sort of adding on to her bank of training, if you will, made a lot of sense.
It seems like you're talking about you being the right option at that time, especially regarding injuries. It seems like that probably played a role in making you the right person to help coach her, since that's kind of what you specialize in research wise.
Well, I was the only option at the time.
Okay.
And I mean, there were probably, with a bit of sort of, it would have been possible for her to be coached by somebody else, no doubt. But from a logistical standpoint and everything else, it made a lot more sense to do it that way. And it did end up working out really well. And it wasn't just me. It was also, it was also the resources that we had in Memphis with, our physio in town, Mark Temi, and other people involved at the time, and still now. But it worked out, as it often does, that way. So, yeah.
Well, and I think, and maybe this is the paper you mentioned getting a lot of press, talking about mileage not being the best indicator of stress load on people.
Yeah.
Is that, that ideology, is that kind of the underlying idea of helping get her out of that cycle? Yeah.
It's a nice transition, by the way, on that. And I think, just to go back to Lauren and what you just asked, I'm not for her, it wasn't so much volume that was the issue particularly.
Okay.
I think at the time of the recurring injuries, it was mostly Achilles injuries and calf injuries and things like that, a couple of foot injuries. It was a lot of the intensity, spending a lot of time on the track, really hammering out track sessions and short sprinting stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with those types of sessions, obviously. It's just the context of not being ready for that.
Mm-hmm.
And some people just aren't, are unfortunately not sort of put together in a way that they can handle a lot of that. And so anyway, it was sort of, for her, to answer your question, wasn't really about mileage per se,
Okay.
but so the paper you're mentioning now is a clinical commentary that myself and Chris Napier, who's a physio up in Canada at UBC, and was also a really good runner himself. He was like a 2:32 marathoner. Rich Willie, who's arguably one of the most from my perspective, and I know from many perspective, one of the best sort of running specific PTs in the world, I would argue. He's based in Montana, and then he's also a PhD in biomechanics, and so is Chris, by the way, Chris Napier. And then Trent Stellingworth, who's a long friend of mine, served as a mentor as well when I was starting out in science. And Trent's Director of Research and Innovation, I believe, is his title up in Victoria at the Kane Sport Institute. And Trent's a sports physiologist, but also sort of sports nutrition realm. And so, anyway, the four of us had been talking about this idea of sort of, it seems obvious to most, but just kind of bringing up some ideas and concepts around why, solely relying on mileage or distance to quantify training in runners might not be best. And again, it's funny. I've spoken to a few Canadians about this, many Europeans, Australians, and everybody's sort of confused. Yeah, it's really obvious, right? and I agree. It's fairly obvious, but I am absolutely baffled by the amount of people in the U.S. Specifically, high school coaches mostly, who are not offended by the concept of saying that mileage is not the best way to quantify training, but just, again, offended might be the best word in the end, but they're just so confused as to how else you would do it, right?
Right.
Which is, I always tell my colleagues in Europe or Australia or wherever that, yeah, you think it's obvious, but it's not. And so in this paper, we basically give some examples and present some reasons as to why using mileage to quantify training is not the best. And so I can kind of talk about that a bit more if you'd like, but there's a lot to talk about in this realm. So it's just kind of up to what you'd like to talk about, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I mean, I talk about this kind of idea, not always in the context of somebody who's done research, but just in the context of how do we figure that? Because I talk to coaches, I talk to athletes. Yeah. I think about, and this really crosses boundaries. In this context, we're talking mileage, but a few weeks ago when I spoke to competitive powerlifter Claire Zai, she also coaches her own kind of group of women, and she's trying to work on like an actual number metric, partially based in RPE, rate of perceived exertion, for anybody who's not familiar with that. And so like she's trying to figure out how to quantify the stress load outside of, okay, you did, this many reps at max, and you did this many sub max reps, and which is like the lifting equivalent of mileage, right? Like you did this many reps at this much weight, so you need this much recovery. Yeah. And it isolates and almost alienates the person from the rest of their life. Yeah. Any of the other stressors, life stressors, training stressors, food, sleep, any of that. Yep. Which is, one of the large issues with mileage being the only thing to go by.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're discussing. I mean, this paper is about running specifically, but it applies to all sports, really.
Right.
So, in swimming, you might say hours of training. In cycling, same thing. I guess in cycling, some people talk about mileage, but it's more about power and wattage and so on. But also the duration of it typically. In cross-country skiing, I'm not too familiar with how it's quantified. I suppose it's because it's more European based. It's probably more time based. Mm-hmm. And then rowing is typically time. To quantify, amount of training or volume of training. So what you mentioned though is exactly that we're trying to get at is that, the amount of distance that you cover per a given time period. Now we can talk about that as well. Like the concept of like, why are we so obsessed with weeks, like 7-day blocks? Like it's just, it doesn't make much sense physiologically or otherwise, right? It's just the idea that like it's convenient Monday through Sunday or Sunday through Saturday or whatever. But anyway, we can talk about that later. But we tend to think, okay, if you run X amount of miles, or let me step back. Often I've always heard people that, well, first we define this like as the obsession for mileage. People are just obsessed, like that's Strava doesn't help, my GPS watches don't help, all these things. Mm. But the idea is that all of this started for me is when, I'm around parents and high school coaches and other coaches. And I hear these things like, well, if you're in grade 10 or whatever, you need to run 40 miles a week, or if you're in, that, or if you're, and I don't mean that in a condescending way. I just, the tone that I just took, but I mean that in that I think most people don't quite understand. Like they've just been told this all the time. Right. And it might have worked for them in the past if a coach was an athlete, or if a parent was an athlete and they just hear this, or if a kid heard their parent or their coach say that, right? They'll just kind of regurgitate because they don't really know why. And I think it's important to educate everyone about what mileage is. And, but the idea that a certain amount of miles is supposed to be run if you're 16 years old, or if you're a girl or a boy, or if you want to run 15 minutes in the 5K as a high school cross-country runner, you need to run, 80, like some threshold of mileage is to me is absolutely absurd. I don't know what other word to describe that, but,
Right.
And then it also translates to injury and research on injury, where people say the findings in the literature on, training related risk factors for injuries are all over the place. It's so inconsistent. Like you look at systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and the findings are typically, well, if you run less than 15 miles a week, you're at risk for injury. If you run more than 45 miles a week, you're at risk of injury. If you run between 20 and 40 miles, you're at risk of injury. It's like, so basically don't run, right? It's kind of what this says.
Right.
And ultimately the idea is that, yes, running, if you're going to run, you might get a running injury. It's like if you play tennis, you get a tennis injury. If you play golf, you might get a golf, whatever. And I think part of the reason why this research is so inconsistent is because a lot of this research designs focus on, distance as the marker of training. And as you described earlier, there's so much more that's going on in athletes' lives that are affecting how they, more importantly, respond to training, and as a result, how they recover or not from training. And so distance doesn't help you with that, right? I guarantee you, I could take 10 runners and have them run 20 miles a week, every week for a year, right, and still get many of them injured.
Mm-hmm.
If that was my challenge for some reason, okay, here's 10 runners max. They can't run more than 20 miles a week, and the goal is to get them injured. Easy. That would be very easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like you don't need 100 miles. Just get 20 miles a week, and I'll have them do, hill sprints every day.
Bro, we could do it with 5 miles a week. We don't even need 20.
Right. We'll cover the Achilles. Let's just crank some track stuff and spikes and hills every day for the first 2 weeks, right? That's probably take care of it.
Yeah.
Or we'll just do, 20 miles, and every day they do, 2 to 4 mile time trials on the road in flats. We'll probably take care of some stress fractures there. So again, when you start thinking about it, you start realizing like, okay, mileage threshold obviously seems a little bit absurd or simplistic. So there's so many different ways, different things to do to do that. And again, I've had people say, things like, well, sometimes it's easier to just say, go run, X amount of miles, or I'm like, well, yeah, okay, you can do that. Or you could also just say, go run for X amount of minutes, either way. And I'm not too picky with that. Like, I don't think prescription of mileage is a problem. I think what we're discussing in this paper is monitoring the response to training, not the prescription, right? Prescription and monitoring are completely different concepts. So I can prescribe some mileage, but I might consider monitoring the response to that mileage differently than just mileage, and so we can talk about training load and other measurements that include RPE, as you mentioned, rate of perceived exertion or effort, and how that comes in to quantify these responses a bit better.
Well, it seems like even if we take, say that group of 10 individuals, and we're going to do 20 miles a week, and we can control for food, everybody gets the same amount of sleep, everybody has the same family somehow, we control for all these things, then you're still not controlling for genetic potential, right? So
but on that topic, there's other factors, like, if you do it for a year, there's gonna be times a year where it's warm or humid or cold or dry or whatever, and depending on who you are, you're going to respond differently to that training exposure in those environments, and as a result, your recovery time or your response from the training will be different. So it's all that. And I see it, I get it in high school. Like if you're a high school coach and you have 40 kids that you train, I get that just prescribing mileage is just convenient, This just is. And I think, I don't mean to be like pointing fingers at college or high school cross country coaches, but there's a reason why the barrier to entry in coaching cross country is so low. Anyone can coach cross country, which is a great thing and a bad thing.
Right.
If that makes sense, right? Because if you don't know anything about running, you'll go online and say, how do I coach cross country runners? And then you'll say, well, you'll read some blog from somewhere that'll say, well, if they're in grade 9, have them run 20 to 30 miles a week. And they're not bad estimations of the anatomical development of a kid at that age. But it's just siloing, everybody into the same spot and saying, okay, well, you run this amount, grade 10 runs this amount. And so anybody can kind of do it. Are the results going to be good? Probably not ideal. Obviously not optimal. But it might still work, because you might get a kid who's just extra talented and do really well with whatever it is that you're giving them, right? And you could give them more or less, but they would still respond the same way, because that's the other thing that we tend not to talk about much in high school sports is that, a lot of high school coaches really take pride in performance and how many trophies and state championships and da, 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 da. But in reality, these kids, they're adapting and developing so quickly that, you could argue that the same kid with half the amount of training could do the same thing.
Right.
It's tough. And of course, there's no way to test this hypothesis, right? There's no way to take a kid and be like, well, let's go through 4 years of high school and then come back and then do it again, right? Because now you're a completely different athlete. So it's, unless you had twins, right? You have, or triplets ideally, so you could have like different control groups.
You go to this school, you go to that school.
Yeah, exactly. So, and even then with twins, there's still variation. So, anyway, so that's kind of some of the reasons for why we decided to kind of write this commentary on in the JOSP and JOSPT, and it's so far it's receiving it's being received very well, and we're getting a lot of emails and messages and podcast episodes on this, and popular media of course picks it up and all that. So it's good to try to get it out. And I'm not, again, this is not new. This is nothing new.
Right.
It's just kind of new to running in the United States. You look at team sports all over the world. I mean, they've been monitoring training in different ways for 50 years plus.
Yeah.
It's just like cross country running and running in general is a bit behind on those things.
Yeah. Do you have, I'll say in an ideal world, because there's all these different kind of like training devices now.
Yep.
They're trying to figure out how to measure the stress load. If you watch, like I watch MLS, so they, the guys have the trackers on them, so they know
GPS,
how far they went. Yeah. And then there's companies like, and I'm not affiliated with them, but I see these commercials on other podcasts I watch, Whoop, that tries to do the stress. Is there currently, not as an endorsement obviously, but is there a currently technology that you would say this does a very good job, or is there something else that needs to be made in an ideal world for you to capture that stress metric?
Yeah, that's a super question. I think so. It's a tough question, but it's a good one in that the answer is yes, but at the moment there isn't one company or one tool or one metric that I would say has made the monitoring process so simplistic that is relevant to runners.
Okay.
So for me as a scientist with a lot of resources at my disposal from the lab and so on and so forth, and computational abilities and whatnot, there are things that are really good. But for the average consumer at the moment, most things are they require a little too much, if that makes sense. So it's just not to the point where anybody can know what this means, or what this metric means, or what this color on a graph means, or what the graph means, period, or whatnot. So that's one problem. The other problem is that the industry, the wearable monitoring industry, has jumped the gun by probably a solid 30 years. And a colleague of mine, Ross Miller, yesterday we were texting, and he said, we won't be able to predict injuries in 100 years. And so you could say they've jumped the gun in 100 years. But I say that because we still don't quite know exactly, like let me put it this way. If scientists can't predict an injury with all the fancy equipment available to them, how can a wearable company that measures things from a watch or a sensor on your shoe do it, right?
Right.
And so if you look at it this way, if the best possible resources, equipment, instruments can't do it yet, how can a wearable company, technology, whatever, do it? It's just, but the fact is that the marketing, statements are basically saying, run injury free and prevent injuries and all this stuff. And it's like, it's insane. And you're sitting here as a scientist, like, look, we're testing these things and we can't even figure this out. How the heck are these people figuring out? And, where's the data? The answer is it's not there,
right.
But marketing and industry is always about, moving forward very quickly.
Right.
Because everybody else is doing it. So if company X does it and makes the claims, company Y can't just sit back and wait till the data comes up in 100 years, right? I mean, of course, like that's not how you do, and that's not how you succeed, I guess, in business. But there's too many limitations at the moment. Like, you can get, like we said, you can get hurt doing nothing. You can get hurt, running a little bit, and you can get hurt running a lot or not. So it's just we're not quite there, and so always beware of claims like that. I will say that, we've just finished a couple of studies that are under review right now, almost through the review process. And one of them was with high school runners. And we addressed that question. And we weren't actually looking at injury risks per se, but we were comparing. We had a high school team that did 2 weeks. We monitored them for a whole 2 weeks. We had, I think, 10 or 12 runners on the same team. So it's not a big sample, but it's from the same team, same coach, same schedule, same racing, same academic, all that. And so week one was, the coach has prescribed a low training week, or a light training week, if you will. And then week two was a heavy training week. So we knew that the intention at least was go from low to high. So then we expect that, everything would go up from week one to week two. But our question was, how much would it go up when we use different ways to quantify this change from week one to week two, right? So, we tracked mileage, we tracked just minutes, we tracked RPE every day, right? Session, our rate of perceived exertion for the whole session. Every day we did that. And then we threw in to answer your question, some more complicated metrics. So we had one where we use inertial measurement units, or basically these sensors that go around the ankles.
Right.
We used insoles that measure forces.
Mm-hmm.
And then we use, of course, stuff from watches like cadence and step count and things like that. Okay. So we had minutes, mileage, and then we compared, we calculated different metrics of training load. And just quickly, training load is typically like the combination of some measure of external load, or like forces acting on the body, and some measure of internal load, physiological load, or how the athlete is responding to those forces, basically, or that training. So our internal load measurement was RPE. That's all we used. Mm-hmm. Okay. Our external load measurements were minutes, step count per run, how many steps you took per run, sort of a proprietary bone load type of measurement from a company, and then an estimated cumulative vertical force per run. So what we did is, every step there's a vertical force, that you can measure, and we took the peak value of that force and we just summed with every step. So we got the average force, and then we multiplied that by the number of steps per run, and that gives us the cumulative force per run. Okay. So the reasoning here was that if we use minutes, or miles, it's pretty simplistic, sort of general oversimplistic sort of generalization of what the load is on the person. When you look at force and, acceleration or shock with the bone estimation, and then steps per run, that becomes a bit more specific to the runner, right? So if every runner runs 30 minutes, the number of steps will not be the same at all, because of different cadences and step lengths and things like that. And then the overall force won't be the same. So basically we compared very simplistic measurements like minutes, and then more complicated measurements all the way down to, estimated force times RPE. And what we found was that anytime we combined RPE and some other measurement of load, we got a different response than if we just looked at minutes, okay? Which is expected, because everybody's going to respond differently. Their RPE will be different. But the really cool finding was that it didn't matter if you use a really complicated measurement, like force or bone load or steps. When you combine with RPE, using minutes was fine. So minutes times RPE per day throughout the whole week gave us the same week-to-week change as force times RPE or bone load times RPE. So the big conclusion was like, We probably should measure training load, some measure of load times RPE to quantify week-to-week changes, but we don't need to make it complex.
Mm-hmm.
So long answer to say that there are companies, but given what we know from a quantifying training to quantify training stress in runners, we probably just need minutes in RPE. We get the same week-to-week change values than if we use really complicated measurements. Now, that's a different question than if you ask me, what about injury risks? And I don't know the answer to that question, right? Or if you said, what about to quantify training in a person who's coming back from injury? In which case, it would depend on the injury, right? So if it's a bone stress injury, you might want to measure things that are more related to bone injuries, which we kind of have an idea of what is related to bone injuries, but not, no one in their right mind is fully, convinced that there are specific things that are related to bone injuries, for example, or something. But so it depends really on the application of how you're quantifying training and why. So if it's just to understand the training response, then I think we have a good concept of that. In terms of predicting injury, not at all. In terms of return to running, a bit better.
Yeah. So in all this that you're saying reminds me of a couple weeks ago, I spoke with Matt Jordan, who works at the Canadian Sport Institute, Calgary. Yeah. And he's doing, I'll say, similar kind of stuff, not the same athletes, but this similar kind of like ideas is what you're talking about, trying to measure these variables. And I spoke with him more about the kind of return after injury. And I hope I'm not misquoting him, this is just off of the top of my head. I think he had mentioned, sometimes an athlete will get the go ahead to return to injury or after injury, and then they stop being monitored, and then basically their recurrence of injury is typically, and I think it was an alpine athlete, like 12 to 18 months after return. And so it's way after return, but we're not paying attention to it. But throughout all of it, that like RPE becomes such a relatively reliable metric.
Right. And people complain sometimes, RPE is subjective. 100% RPE is subjective. But if whoever's, rating effort or exertion knows what the purpose of or knows why it's being used and understand and has the proper instructions on to how to use it, people can be very, they can report RPE reliably and consistently. And so that's the most important thing. I don't care that it's subjective. That's irrelevant, because when you're asking someone about their effort, you don't care how their effort compares to somebody else. You care about how, their actual effort. So they have to be able to answer that for themselves reliably every day. Right. And that's all that matters. And that's where science and practice sometimes clashes, because a lot of science is like, you have a small sample size and you only have X amount of athletes. And then coaches are talking about science like, well, you're only looking at college students. You're not looking at my elite athletes that have very specific, attributes. And they're both right.
Right.
If I'm a coach, I only care about my athletes, how they respond to my training. Right. And then what I can do to adjust their training to make them better. And so, that's what, obviously Matt has done some great work in that realm. I don't know Matt personally, but I know, of him because one, he works in Canada, and two, he's done a lot of work in that realm in ACL rehab and so on and so forth. But so that's true to all injuries and rehab and return to play program, is just to understand whether or not your measurements are reliable, whether your measurements are valid, and what changes in those values mean. And that's often why we struggle, if there's a change in the value of a metric by 2 or 3 points, is that meaningful or not? And it might not be for athlete X, but it might be for athlete Y, which is why it becomes complicated. And that's why it convolutes the findings in the literature. But that's the nature of it, right? Which is why I like doing what I do, which is, yes, I'm a lab scientist, but I also, have a big foot, or I have a foot in the applied performance world, where I talk to coaches and athletes and I understand, and there's a lot of scientists like that, but there's also a lot of scientists who are just in the lab.
Right.
And that gets lost in translation, literally.
Yeah. So it makes you wonder if all of that comes back to, I think I saw a post from you, I think it was on your Instagram, showing your watch and how you went back to not using the more complicated watch.
Yeah, so I have this fancy watch right here. Shout out
Yeah.
to Steph Bruce, who gave me this watch. It's a Polar watch, and it's fancy. It's great. It looks great. Actually, I like how it looks. I like how it feels when I wear it, and I like to track my sleep with it. Not that I'm not sure how well it tracks my sleep, but at least I get a feel for it, every day, and it can give me my heart rate here and there if I want to. Again, I'm not sure how valid it is, but for running, and I understand that I can turn all the notifications and things off, but for running, to me, I don't use, I'm not a marathoner, nor will I ever be. If I'm a marathoner and I need to run 26.2 miles, well, I know I have to run, I know I have to put my body through that distance, right? At some point, at the pace that I want to run. In which case, a GPS watch makes sense unless you have a mapped out course. But for me, running is more about, there's specific workouts that might be interval based, but most of it is just spending time out there. One of my good friends used to say, it's all about spending time on the dance floor. And it's true, you're spending time, you're putting your time in, you're doing, we don't measure age in distance, we measure age in years, so why do we measure training in distance, Anyway, I could go all day about the distance versus time thing, but ultimately for me, it's about, at this point in my life, it's more about when I want to go run, I have a set period of time to go run. And if I feel crappy and I'm running slower and I run longer than I have time for, I don't want to be rushed or stressed to get back, kind of thing. So I got 30 minutes. I'm going to go run 30 minutes. I don't care how far I go, how slow I go, how fast I go, because I'm not training for anything really. I just like to go and enjoy my time out there,
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people would have there'd be value for a lot of people in using that approach where you're not so concerned with pace. And, when you start being concerned with pace on your easy runs or your recovery runs, you might want to consider changing how you approach running. And just because, yes, again, there's value in running certain paces during specific sessions with specific intentions. But when you're just trying to get you're just trying to get out there and put in the time and the training, it doesn't always matter how fast you go. And that's a really hard concept to tell kids.
Yeah.
Young runners who see pro runners, who post their Strava, I did an easy run in 6:30 pace and so on and so forth. Which if you spend time looking at Strava accounts of pro runners, even the best, you'll see their easy runs sometimes are 7:30, 7:40 pace, 7:10. Again, that sounds fast for many. But compared to what they run, sub 5-minute pace, for example, 4:30 pace, it's sometimes 3 minutes off.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of high school kids will be racing at 6-minute pace and they're running their easy runs at 6:45 pace.
Right.
But yet they think they have to run fast. They think it's an absolute number. It's not. It's all relative to what they can do, how they respond to that, how they feel, so on and so forth. So anyway, long story to tell you, that's why I don't use this watch to run, and I use my old Timex, my old faithful, loyal, $30 Target Timex watch.
Yeah, that's something I've definitely spent a lot of time trying to stress with people in general, but I also do a show just about running. And I don't know, I've had people comment, and recently I had a gentleman coming back from being bedridden of all things in the hospital, trying to get back to running. And he's like, I'm running 6-minute pace and I can only run for 90 seconds. And I'm like, look, I have a friend who runs low 30s for his 10K and he runs 7 to 8 minute pace. There's zero reason to be running at 6-minute pace. You were just bedridden. Just slow down, slow down. It is so hard to get into people's head that they don't have to go fast to get more fit.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if you look about performance predictors, it's not how many specific workouts you do. It's typically just, how much volume have you done? How much training have you done over the years? Right. You look at the Ingebrigtsen brothers, the Norwegian brothers. There was a really cool study published about the three brothers maybe 2 years ago. And it basically just summarized their lives as athletes, what they had done as kids. And if you look at it, 90% of their training plus probably is just basic aerobic work, cross-country skiing, like running easy. I mean, all these things that are just purely just running, not fast, just running, like just 100% aerobic type work. And I think people get too caught up with like specific workouts often. Like at the high school level, if you're running consistently and you're doing a little more here and there, and once in a while you run hard, and you don't race every single weekend, just some basic consistent exposure with little interruptions like injuries, right? Your long-term success is going to be much better if you just have, you're not trying to be you're not trying to be the high school kid who runs 80 to 100 miles a week. And yes, there are kids that do that and they're successful, and that's part of the problem, because, and I don't mean that like that kid shouldn't do that or whatever. I'm just saying most kids can't do that, but yet a kid like that will be idolized and put on a pedestal. And, Flow Track picks it up and this picks it up. And then all the high school kids are like, oh, this kid's a god and I need to do that. And then they don't understand that, yeah, this kid's a god, but in your eyes, but also from a physiological standpoint, he's a bit of a freak, and not in a bad way, and just in a freak of nature.
Right,
and
an anomaly.
He's an outlier. Like we have a kid in Tennessee here who runs like a 9:40 something 2 mile, like a 16:30 5K, a girl, a grade 10 or 11 girl.
Yeah.
And, it would be very easy for a kid or a parent or a coach who doesn't know much about running, or even if they know a lot about running, it just depends on how you process information. But they might say, well, to be that good, you need to do this. Whatever she's doing, you need to do it. And that's where the education comes in handy.
Yeah. Max, as we're starting to run out of time, it's a question I ask everybody this season. I'm going to ask you too, because it kind of hits the high point for everybody. It doesn't matter what the sport or discipline is. So I'm curious on your opinion of what you think the purpose of sport is.
The purpose of sport. Wow. What a question. That's very philosophical. Wow. Well, I think I'm not really I'm not really a sports fan. What I mean by that is I don't really have a team, or I don't really follow. Like, I'm not the kind of person to be like, you see the game last night? Just how many points this guy, and I know I'm an outlier in that sense, as a 35-year-old, man in America. But to me, sport was always about, doing something where you're always trying to improve upon whatever it is that you're doing, whatever sport it is, and it's kind of a vicious cycle in a way, because you set these goals for yourself in a sport, and then you get to it, you're like, okay, what's next? And it just kind of keeps getting harder and harder. And the higher you get, the harder it gets, right? So to me, sport is almost like, not from the sports fan standpoint, from an athlete's perspective, to me, it's always about, it's really like, it's an education process. Whatever you do as an athlete, whatever you do in sport, it becomes a learning process that you will apply to everything else. And I've done that in my career, where I'm like, okay, I want to get to this level. Okay, now I got it faster than I thought, perhaps, or later than I thought. Okay, what's next? And you go to something else. And it's always about, it teaches ultimately to, sort of challenge yourself, right? So philosophically, it's more of a challenge than anything else, individually or personally. So that's kind of how I see sport. And I don't think sport itself is better than art, for example, or literature, or any other concepts, in the sense that you're trying to achieve the highest of levels of whatever it is you're doing. And sport is just a vehicle for that, where if you like sports, you want to get better at it. If you're a musician, you want to master this aspect of guitar, and then you get, it's the same stuff, right?
Right.
So yeah, education, I guess, challenging yourself, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Solid answer.
Yeah.
Max, if people want to keep up with your research, see what you're doing, any of that kind of stuff, where can they find you?
Yeah, I use Twitter a fair amount. So I'm on Twitter with the tag is, or the handle is biomechmax. So very original as a biomechanist, but yeah, just biomech max. And I don't really use Instagram professionally as much as I do Twitter.
Yeah.
So that's, I think there's a lot of good discussions that happen on Twitter, and that'd be it. And then of course we have a College of Health Sciences website, their faculty profiles and research pages and things like that.
Yeah. For anybody listening who has any interest, do check out Max's Twitter, because there was, as I prepared for speaking with you, there's way more there than I could digest in the time I had allotted. So there's definitely a lot of like good stuff. If you're interested in running and research and biomechanics, all that kind of stuff that Max posts about, there's a lot of good information there. So thanks for hanging out with me today, Max.
I enjoyed it. Let's do it again sometime.